You have probably walked past the same part of your yard 100 times and thought, nothing is ever going to grow there. Maybe it is a big oak tree throwing shade across half your beds. Maybe it is the house itself blocking the afternoon sun. Maybe it is a fence or a neighbour's garage or some combination of all of it. And so you just write that space off. I did the exact same thing for my first few years of gardening. I had this whole section along my north-facing fence that I completely ignored because I figured, what is the point? Then one spring, curiosity got the better of me. I started putting a few things in there just to see what would happen. And honestly, the results surprised me. Some of those crops did not just survive, they actually performed better in the shade than they did in my full sun beds. In this video, I am going to walk you through exactly which fruits, vegetables, and herbs you can grow in a shady yard. And more importantly, I'm going to explain the science behind why shade is not the death sentence most gardeners assume it is. Stick around for the bonus tip at the end because it is a simple strategy that noticeably increased my harvests in low-light beds, and it took me several seasons of tracking data to figure it out. Here is the thing most people miss about shade gardening. You are not working with a disadvantage. You are working with a different set of conditions, and once you understand the science, you realize that a huge number of edible plants actually prefer those conditions. Most home gardeners leave anywhere from a third to half of their usable growing space completely empty because they assume shade equals failure. That is a lot of wasted potential. Get this right, and you could effectively double the productive area of your garden. Get it wrong, and you spend season after season ignoring space that could be feeding you. I am going to walk you through this in a logical order. We will start with understanding what kind of shade you actually have and how to measure it. Then we will move through the best crops, organized by how well they handle low light. I will cover the technique adjustments you need to make, the most common problems and how to fix them. And I will wrap up with that bonus tip. Every step builds on the one before it, so it should all come together as we go. 3 to 6 hours of direct sun. That is the definition of partial shade for us, and that is the range where everything in this video applies. Now, let me explain why that number matters and why you need to measure it yourself. Not all shade is equal. A bed that gets 4 hours of gentle morning sun behaves very differently from one that gets 4 hours of intense afternoon sun. Morning light is cooler and less likely to stress heat-sensitive plants. Afternoon light carries more thermal energy and can still cause bolting in crops that are prone to it. I learned this the hard way when I assumed all my shady spots were the same and planted lettuce in a bed that caught 3 hours of blazing western sun. It bolted in 2 weeks. So here is what I recommend. Pick a day and check your garden every hour from about 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening. Write down which beds are in sun and which are in shade at each check. By the end of the day, you will have a simple map that tells you exactly what you're working with. One sensory shortcut I use now is this. If your soil still feels cool and slightly damp by mid-afternoon, you're almost certainly in a true partial shade zone. That brings us to the question of why some crops actually prefer less sun, 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the soil temperature sweet spot for most cool season crops. The science behind this is actually pretty simple. Many of the vegetables we grow, especially leafy greens and root crops, evolved in cooler climates or in the understory of taller plants. They are not built for 8 hours of blazing direct sun. When temperatures climb too high or light exposure gets too intense, these plants trigger a stress response called bolting. That is when the plant stops producing leaves and rushes to flower and set seed. It is basically a survival mechanism. The plant thinks conditions are getting hostile, so it shifts all its energy into reproduction. Shady beds naturally stay cooler and more stable in temperature, which means the soil hovers closer to that ideal range without you having to do anything. Once I understood this one concept, my entire approach to garden layout changed. I stopped thinking of shade as a problem and started thinking of it as a tool. Once you have your shade mapped out, the first crops to put in are leafy greens: spinach, lettuce, and chard. Those three are your foundation in a shady garden. Spinach is extremely cold tolerant, but bolts fast in heat, which makes a partially shaded bed ideal for extending its season well into late spring or even early summer. Lettuce is shallow, rooted, and benefits from the cooler, more consistently moist soil that Shade provides. I recommend choosing cultivars that mature in 35 to 45 days rather than 55 plus, since growth will be a bit slower with less light. Chard is the one I would call nearly indestructible. You can treat it almost like a perennial. Plant it once, keep harvesting the outer leaves, and it just keeps producing. I have had chard plants go for over a year in a shady corner of my garden. One important note for all three: start your seeds indoors and transplant. Germination in cool, shady soil can be painfully slow, especially spinach, which sometimes takes up to 2 weeks, even under good conditions. Getting them started under a grow light or on a sunny windowsill and then moving healthy seedlings into the bed saves you a lot of waiting. That brings us to the shade-tolerant vegetables that go beyond salad greens: peas, radishes, and green onions. All three will produce in partial shade, though each one needs a slightly different approach. Peas are a classic spring crop that naturally struggles in heat. Shade extends their productive window. I soak my pea seeds for about 12 hours before planting, and that alone cut my germination time noticeably. They are shallow-rooted, so keep the soil consistently moist and add a layer of mulch to help with that. Radishes will still bulb up in shade, but expect to add roughly 15 extra days to whatever the seed packet says for maturity. That is a fair trade for using space you are not going to plant anyway. Green onions are a smart choice because you are harvesting the leaves, not waiting for a bulb to develop. Bulb onions need all the sun they can get to size up properly, but green onions just need enough light to keep pushing out new growth, and 3 to 4 hours of sun handles that just fine. If you are finding this helpful, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out new videos every week where I break down the science behind growing better food at home. It is free, and it means you will not miss the next one. All right, let us keep going. Now, this is where it gets interesting because herbs are one of the most overlooked categories for shade gardening. Cilantro and parsley are the two I recommend first. Both bolt quickly in full sun and heat, so shade actually works in your favor by extending their harvest window significantly. For cilantro specifically, look for a slow bolt cultivar. Even with that, full sun will still push it to flower faster than you want. In a shady bed, I have kept cilantro producing usable leaves for 3 to 4 weeks, longer than the same variety planted in direct sun. You will know bolting is coming when the leaves shift from those wide, flat, familiar shapes to thin, feathery, almost carrot-like foliage. That is your signal to harvest everything you can. Basil is more of a stretch in shade, but certain varieties like African blue basil handle partial light surprisingly well. It will not grow as fast, but it will still produce. Once you have your crop selected, you need to adjust your technique for shady conditions. 3 things change: water less often. That is the first adjustment, and it is the one most people get wrong. The science is straightforward. Less direct sun means less evaporation from the soil surface and less transpiration from the leaves. The soil stays moist longer. I lost an entire bed of young lettuce seedlings my second year because I was watering my shady beds on the same schedule as my full sun beds, and the roots just rotted. Now I check by pushing my finger about an inch into the soil. If it still feels damp, I skip that day. The second adjustment is to transplant instead of direct sowing whenever possible. Shady soil runs cooler, often 5 to 10 degrees below what you will find in a sun-exposed bed. Many seeds need soil temperatures in that 65 to 75 degree range to germinate reliably, and shady ground may not reach that until well into the season. Starting indoors on a seedling heat mat and then transplanting gives you a huge head start. The third adjustment is resetting your expectations on timing. Expect everything to take roughly 15 to 25% longer to mature. That is not a failure. That is just the physics of less light energy driving photosynthesis at a slower rate. That brings us to maximizing the light your shady beds do receive, and there are 3 practical things you can do. Prune overhanging branches, especially on fruit trees. As soon as they finish producing for the season, I pruned back my largest shade tree after its fruit harvest and gained roughly 30 extra minutes of direct sun per day in the bed below it. That does not sound like much, but over a full growing season, it adds up. Second, if you have a fence or wall adjacent to a shady bed, consider painting it a lighter color. Light colors reflect significantly more sunlight back. Toward your plants. The physics here is basic. Dark surfaces absorb light energy as heat, while light surfaces bounce it back. Third, consider growing in containers so you can rotate them into sunnier spots as needed. I think of my shady area as a staging zone. Most of the time, the containers sit there happily, but if something needs a boost, I can move it into better light for a few days. Now, let me run through the most common problems I see in shade gardens and what is actually causing them. Leggy, stretched out seedlings. That is phototropism. The plant is reaching toward whatever limited light it can find. The fix is simple. Start indoors under a grow light and only transplant once the seedling is strong and stocky. If it is already leggy in the bed, you cannot reverse it, but you can support the stem and improve light access by pruning anything overhead. Seeds that never germinate when direct sown. 9 times out of 10, the soil is too cool. Use a soil thermometer. If it reads below 60 degrees, you are better off starting indoors and transplanting. Root rot and damping off. Overwatering in shade is the #1 killer I see. The soil holds moisture much longer without direct sun baking it off. Reduce your watering frequency and make sure your soil has good drainage. If you're growing in containers, make sure they have adequate drainage holes, bolting despite being in shade. This one catches people off guard. Not all cultivars are created equal. If you plant a standard cilantro variety that is bred for speed, it will still bolt even in shade. Always choose slow bolt or heat-tolerant cultivars for your shady beds. Variety selection matters just as much as placement. Lower yields than you expected. This is normal, and it is not a sign you did something wrong. Shade gardening trades peak yield for extended season and reduced maintenance. You will harvest less at any single picking, but your beds will produce over a longer window. Now, this is something I stumbled onto about 7 or 8 years into my gardening journey, and the science behind it is actually pretty simple, but it took me a while to connect the dots. Succession planting works exceptionally well in shade, better than in full sun, in fact. Here is why. Because shady beds stay cooler and more stable in temperature, your cool season crops resist bolting for much longer. That means each individual planting stays productive over a longer window. So instead of putting in one big planting of lettuce or spinach and watching it all bolt at once when a heat wave hits, stagger your sowings every 2 to 3 weeks. I started tracking this in a notebook about 5 years ago, and consistently, my shady beds outproduced my full sun beds for total cool season greens harvested over an entire season. Not per picking, but total season yield. The stable conditions just kept each planting going longer. It completely changed how I plan my garden layout every year. That is everything I have for you today. Gardening is one of those things where the more you learn, the more you realize there is to discover. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next video.